As the Dundee V&A, Scotland's design museum, prepares to open, we're sharing stories from the city. Discover Dundee with BBC Radio Scotland. This is Billy Kay, celebrating Frankenstein Dundee. I'm standing on the steps of South Baffin Street, looking down to the great expanse of the River Tay and the harbour of Dundee. Today, it's very much part of the city, but in 1812, these were the grounds of a country mansion, home to the family of William Thomas Baxter and a newly arrived 14-year-old guests from London who would transform English literature and popular culture with her seminal novel, Frankenstein. This is her recalling the time she spent here.
I lived principally in the country as a girl and passed a considerable time in Scotland. I made occasional visits to the more picturesque parts, but my habitual residence was on the blank and dreary northern shores of the Tay, near Dundee. Blank and dreary on retrospection, I call them. They were not so to me then. They were the eyrie of freedom, and the pleasant region where, unheeded, I could commune with the creatures of my fancy.
In the introduction to Frankenstein, she talks about this period in Dundee as being a time where she had the freedom to run around and to indulge her fancy in creating stories. So I think the experience in Dundee at such a formative age is absolutely crucial to her future authorship and her creation of Frankenstein.
I wrote then, but in a most commonplace style. It was beneath the trees of the grounds belonging to our house, or on the bleak sides of the woodless mountains near, that my true compositions, the airy flights of my imagination, were born and fostered.
We know that there are specific scenes in the novel that echo what she wrote in letters about Dundee.
Mary Shelley looks back very fondly on her time in Dundee. She talks about being inspired by the eerie River Tay, playing in the forests, and I think that's what gave rise to her dark, monstrous imagination.
I did not make myself the heroine of my tales. Life appeared to me too commonplace an affair as regarded myself. I could not figure to myself that romantic woes or wonderful events would ever be my lot. But I was not confined to my own identity, and I could people the hours with creations far more interesting to me at that age than my own sensations.
The interesting thing about Shelley coming to Dundee is the trust that her father, Godwin, puts in William Thomas Baxter and his family. Just to give over your daughter and to let her come all the way up to Dundee, which is a week's sail away, seems to me quite a brave kind of move.
I just have the assumption that Dundee was far away enough from London to be a type of exile. Mary Shelley didn't get on with her stepmother, and he wants her to receive a better education than she was receiving in London.
This is the letter he sends to William Baxter in advance of Mary's arrival, and it's quite an extraordinary letter, I think, to write about your daughter. I am anxious that she should be brought up in this respect like a philosopher, even like a cynic. It will add greatly to the strength and worth of her character.
Novelist Leslie McDowell and the words of Mary Shelley, read by Eleanor House. Mary would spend 15 months of her life in Dundee between 1812 and 1814. The author of Dundee's Literary Lives, Andrew Murray Scott, joined me on the spot where she lived.
It was called The Cottage. And the thing about that is it's sort of self-deprecating, because it wasn't a cottage at all, it was a mansion, and it was set in very luxurious treed grounds, which we are standing in now.
A description of it in 1816. The house is pleasantly situate in the midst of an acre of ground, laid out in a lawn and garden well stocked with fruit trees, currant and gooseberry bushes of the best sorts, and sheltered from the north by a thriving wood of beautiful forest trees.
So quite a big house, and nothing in front of it to block the view down to the river.
She came to Dundee first on the Osnaburg, a fast packet, but even then it took 6 days to come from the Thames to the Tay. She was actually pickpocketed on her first trip. She was so sick she was not aware of that, but she got here.
She went into a warm family atmosphere where everyone was friendly and kind and they got on, and she had that, I think, probably for the first time.
In her adopted family, Mary was surrounded by girls her own age who had also lost their mother. The father, William Thomas Baxter, was a linen manufacturer who belonged to the dissenting Glassite Church and was active in the radical politics of the city, spawned by the French Revolution. Gordon Bannerman of Guelph Humber University.
Baxter himself, there's some evidence that he provided some financial support during the treason trials. So clearly he was at an early stage involved in the radical movement.
Dundee persists as being a very radical city, a city with lots of visionaries, people who want to reform things. And I think that Mary Shelley clearly benefited from that environment.
Mary Shelley's parents were William Godwin, the radical philosopher, and Mary Wollstonecraft, often seen as the first major feminist in the English-speaking world.
Daniel Cook and Eddie Small of Dundee University on the perfect match between Mary's literary family heritage and the culture of her adopted city and country. As a passionate devotee of her mother's vindication of the rights of women, for example, Mary would have valued Robert Burns's supporting words. Amid this mighty fuss, just let me mention, the rights of women merit some attention. But perhaps a more crucial legacy for Mary was her relationship with one of the Baxter girls, Isabella.
I think it's one of the most important relationships Mary had because she was unhappy in London. Her father had remarried. There were no two children in that family had the same parentage, and I think Mary was really struggling to find her place in it. And she was sent up to Dundee, and she formed a very strong attachment with Isabella straight away. She was in her teens when she went to Dundee, and it's such an important age because it's the age at which you're experiencing your sexuality for the first time. And we see that with Mary. There is, I think, a hint of bisexuality about Mary all the way through her life. So you've got that going on at the same time too, and those things are crucial.
And we know that she and Isabella would recite poetry to each other in the garden, that they would actually write together. Mary Shelley did not know her mother. And I think in some ways that was why she and Isabella Baxter also got on so well, that both of them were motherless.
William Godwin wrote memoirs about his wife. He talks in detail about the death of his wife in childbirth. Young Mary read all of this, and you get a sense that one of the major themes in Frankenstein is the dangers of childbirth. It's about monstrous motherhood. In many ways, Victor Frankenstein is trying to short-circuit the system. He's taking the female body out of the equation. He gives birth to the creature, and we deal with the legacy, the aftermath of that monstrous birth.
Also, they were very intrigued by the stories of witchcraft in Dundee. She and Isabella Baxter are reciting poetry to each other, but also writing tales. We get a strong sense of a literary mind that's alert and consistent in its fascination with literature and folklore.
Angela Wright of the University of Sheffield, author of the book Mary Shelley. Another important figure in the tangled web of relationships was David Booth, who was known as the Devil in Newborough. He had married Isabella's sister Margaret, and when she died, he turned his attentions on Mary and Isabella. Isabella married him, while 16-year-old Mary eloped with the married poet Percy Bysshe Shelley.
Percy Shelley mentioned him as being the one person who he viewed as being far superior to him in terms of intellect. And it's clear that David Booth was incredibly smart, but also quite idiosyncratic. One time, Mary and Isabella visited him across the Tay. He promised to show them paradise and then took them down a coal mine. But there's a sense that both Isabella Baxter and Mary Shelley were intrigued with him as teenagers.
Isabella was also, I think, a little bit more mature in her outlook than Mary. She was more political than Mary. I think Isabella is the one who put her on track almost towards Shelley.
Isabella Baxter from one portrait we have of her, is also seen to look quite like Percy Bysshe Shelley physically.
I think it's more than just a physical resemblance to Isabella that I think attracted her to Shelley. There's a great romance there. When Isabella dresses up, I think she's about 14 or something, and she dresses up for a party as Lady Jane Grey. She was a queen for 9 days and she was beheaded when she was a teenager. So she had a great romantic streak. Shelley obviously has that too. It's interesting that when she goes back to London, she has a tartan dress and she wears it. And people have remarked on her obvious fondness for her time in Scotland.
And I think closer to home, Dundee is a very Gothic city. Where she stayed would have been quite close to the medieval plague pits.
Rudyard Cemetery is there as well, and that in itself would darken the outlook, if you like. Rudyard's was the plague cemetery. That would have been part of her daily wander around.
She would have heard stories about the witches. I think she would have been fascinated by the local legends.
Especially ones with a Gothic frisson, like the story of the Spey wife Grizzle Jaffrey, strangled and burned as a witch in 1669.
She was burned to death in the Seagate and the last witch to be burned in Dundee. To get into Dundee, she has to walk along the Cowgate and touch the Seagate, so she would pass the place where the burning took place.
The cottage, as we can see, we're on quite a slope here, and even now in the modern days you can see down South Baffin Street over the harbour. And at that time Dundee was Whaling City, known by another local author as Blubber Town.
The house Ellen Gowan, at the time she's living in the cottage, it belongs to a shipmaster who is a whaler. So yeah, the next door neighbour it's a thriving port, but you would see this and there'd be a romance about the whaling.
The whaling vessels from Dundee varied from only one ship to about 10 ships, each vessel holding between 32 men and 44. So multiply that by 10, it's quite a chunk of seamen going out from Dundee.
Even if she didn't start writing Frankenstein in Dundee, in her head she started to have a story, and that story became the framing narrative of Robert Walton, the Arctic explorer who wishes to go to the land of mist and snow. He has been on whaling ships prior to getting his boat.
You would come home in the winter and you go out there in the summer. You wouldn't see the summer in Scotland. You just saw winter after winter. And some people are out there 30 or 40 years just living in the ice. And if you think their actual life is dedicated to killing, it must have some effect.
Historian Malcolm Archibald. Mary would have heard stories galore about ships like the Rodney and Dundee, trapped in the ice and lost forever. In his book Whale Hunters, Malcolm quotes a doctor whose crews were psychopaths, men with suffering minds, and a captain whose ship had a large proportion of madmen.
And that's confirmed by their actions a lot of time. There are cases of Dundee whaling men playing football on the ice with sealskin balls, even though polar bears are around, and men running from ship to ship from polar bears.
And this was possibly the only place you could see monsters, actual monsters. Thousands of carcasses of seals, walruses, polar bears, piled on the docks, piles of tusks. It must have been quite a carnal sight.
She might see the whale bone from the jaw, which would be dripping onto the ship, and that was a horrible thing. The women cleaned that, which was covered in grizzle and fat and possibly blood as well. Whale ships were not pretty when they came in. They were stinking things, apparently. They would float the blubber and the barrels from the ship to the shore and then carry it to the boiling yards, and it was boiled there into oil.
In the novel, Mary Shelley brings the scientist Victor Frankenstein for a sojourn in Scotland.
Victor Frankenstein remarks, "We left Edinburgh in a week, passing through Cooper, St Andrews and along the banks of the Tay to Perth." So she's mapping her own experiences of the topography of Scotland onto those of the experiences of the Genevan Victor Frankenstein.
And George Rosey was inspired to do the same in his novel Death's Enemy.
What I decided to do was to take the fictional character of Victor Frankenstein through the real science of the day.
and the real science of galvanism and experimentation with electricity to revive corpses or give birth to monsters was particularly active in the renowned anatomy classes of Edinburgh and Glasgow, where George Rose's fictional Frankenstein observes a real groundbreaking experiment.
Andrew Ure, who had actually carried out the experiment, wrote his own account, and it seems to have really activated the body in a way that was completely unexpected. It was a fairly spectacular business which had half the audience rushing out in fright, other people crying blasphemy, and very controversial.
And we know that one time they applied an electrical current to a corpse on the dissecting table. And you have to imagine all of these students craning their necks to look down these steep banks of seats. The moment where the electrical current is applied to the finger of this corpse, and that corpse actually sits up on the dissecting table.
He lifted his arms and fingers started to move, and the face twitched and the eyes opened, and people were getting really scared of this dead man making all these gestures.
And the experimentation of galvanism was happening in the run-up to the publication of Frankenstein.
Then, in contrast to the scientific, Scotland also provides a home for the supernatural. Bram Stoker's Dracula at Slains Castle, Aberdeenshire, Edgar Allan Poe in Ayrshire at the height of the body-snatching epidemic, and native writers with a penchant for the macabre.
Scotland as a country and the Scots as people have embraced Gothic. In many ways, the home of Gothic. Robert Burns, Walter Scott, they wrote Gothic stories, and they were certainly inspired by Gothic writing.
Gothic literature has often claimed that its genesis lay in a dream. She talks about seeing in this waking dream the vision of a creator bending over the dissection table and looking at the creature. Mary Shelley had what she claimed was a waking hypnagogic nightmare, and that's a nightmare where you see in a very visual way what is in front of you. And she repeats the use of the words, I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on the working of some powerful engine, show signs of life and stir with an uneasy, half-vital motion. Frightful must it be. So the waking hypnagogic nightmare means that she opens her eyes in terror. She's moving, she claims, between the states of waking and sleeping as she imagines this scene, and she starts with the creation of the monster, which is at the heart of the novel.
The monstrous birth in Frankenstein was conceived in the Villa Diodati on Lake Geneva in 1816, when another Scot, George Gordon Lord Byron, asked each of his guests to write a ghost story. Isabella Baxter was to go on the same trip, but her husband David Booth put a stop to it. In her novel Unfashioned Creatures, Leslie McDowell explores these relationships and the madness which took Booth to an asylum.
In the novel, I have Isabella say, I think madness is dormant in all of us, men as much as women, until something or someone sparks it into life. I think Isabella is aware of the link between genius and madness, or the fine line between the two. And I think living so close to madness also must have been something that affected her to the point where it must have put her over the edge.
I have renewed my acquaintance with the friend of my girlish days. She has been ill a long time, even disturbed in her reason.
The set of relationships between the families are fairly extraordinary and very reminiscent, in fact, of a Gothic-type novel. It's really very much a tale of high drama, romance, and ultimately tragedy.
I think Freud would have had a field day with the relationships that are going on here. Mary is back in London and she meets Shelley. Booth has a real problem with Shelley. He tells Isabella that he doesn't want her to have anything more to do with Mary.
They became, estranged, and she felt that she'd lost Isabella to her marriage.
For Mary Shelley, though, there were greater tragedies to thole and overcome.
Mary's half-sister, Fanny, kills herself. Harriet, Shelley's former wife, kills herself as well. You have these terrible, tragic early deaths of young women.
Mary Shelley had a very difficult life, even before the publication of Frankenstein, which happened when she was just turning 19. She had already lost one child by then, and she went on to have more miscarriages, stillbirths, after the publication of Frankenstein. All of the people that she gathered and knew at the Villa Diodati in Lake Geneva fell off one by one in the 1820s, and there's a sense of a lost world for her and lost possibility.
When her husband died tragically at sea, Mary was left to bring up her one surviving child. Now, the novel Frankenstein had a mixed reception, and sales may not even have justified a reprint, but the story took off in the theatre in 1823, and that guaranteed her renown and her legacy. Angela Wright.
She writes in her diary that she found herself famous at this point. It's the first of many, many dramatisations. It's first made into film in 1910. James Whale makes it particularly famous with Boris Karloff as a nameless monster as well, who also has green makeup like the original first play, Presumption.
How important is her age in the writing of Frankenstein?
It's hugely important. Obviously, Mary Shelley was a teen when she came up with the idea of the novel. Mary Shelley was one of the first young adult authors. Young adult, nowadays, that genre is meant for a teen audience. So I read Frankenstein as quite inspirational for a lot of the novels that are coming out nowadays.
I think Mary Shelley might be the most influential teenager who ever lived in terms of popular culture. The IMDb lists more than 170 films based on Frankenstein, either sequels of or reworkings of. They tend to be very comical. Frankenweenie, Frankenstein meets the space monster, but also they can be iconic. Think about James Whale's 1931 Frankenstein, and also the follow-up, The Bride of Frankenstein. These are the iconic versions of Frankenstein brought to life so menacingly by Boris Karloff, and also later Bela Lugosi as well. Films, comics, pop songs, Halloween parties. I think her work has penetrated all facets of our culture.
And back in Dundee, those steps in South Baffin Street are better kent locally as the Frankenstein steps, to commemorate the cottage or the novel, or by some uncanny coincidence, that iconic film.
This is the northern grounds of the cottage where Mary came to stay. But when the cottage was demolished to make way for present-day Watson Street, cinemas were built. Firstly, the Glebe Cinema, then the Eden Bank, and finally the Royalty Kinema. And 100 years after the preface, in 1931, the Royalty Kinema right here is showing Frankenstein, the film, right on the site where Mary Shelley had originally stayed. So the monster lumbered about here, at least on the screen. In the film, unfortunately, the monster is simply a monster. Lumbering, bandaged head, gave rise to so many risible serials and follow-ups. Box office millions were made, but it is a clunking, different concept from Mary's very, very elegant and intellectual creation.
I see Frankenstein as one of the first novels that gives the monster a voice. You do notice when the creature confronts the family, he feels they're kind enough, he feels he can come out of the shadows, so to speak. He is rejected, and it's because of his physical appearance. The creature is probably purer than a lot of the actions of mankind in the book.
Lauren Christie of the University of Dundee. For all the personal tragedies in her life, Mary Shelley never forgot her friend Isabella Baxter.
The friendship persists and clearly becomes a source of consolation and solace as they both get older.
Mary is supportive of Isabella through her life. She writes applications to the Royal Literary Fund on Isabella's behalf. When David Booth goes mad and needs treatment, she writes them for money for her. So she actually does stay a loyal friend.
Throughout her life, Mary Shelley was constantly worried about money. So the fact that she leaves money to Isabella Booth is very significant.
And another significant woman that Mary would have met here was Mary Ann Baxter, founder of the University of Dundee.
She was born in 1801, so she would be a young teenager at the time. When be here, of course, she'd be taken along to see this young London woman who's only 2 or 3 years older than she is. And of course, our university opens in 1883, and she demands that women and men are taught in the same classroom. This is a first in the United Kingdom for all subjects.
In later life, Mary also befriended the Dundonian radical Fanny Wright, who became a feminist pioneer in America. Mary also gives Scottish settings to novels like The Last Man, Matilda and Perkin Warbeck, so there are many fascinating strands to her sojourn in the city for us to celebrate.
Well, if I think about something like Whitby, for example, and its relationship with Dracula and how they've capitalised on that association where they have a yearly festival about it, I really think it's about time that Dundee was doing something similar. She was there for a substantial length of time. It really informed her opinions and her character. I personally would love to see a regular festival every single year. Yes, based on Mary Shelley, but devoted to issues around Frankenstein, the Gothic, the romance, all of those things.
Because truly, in the introduction to the 1831 edition of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley describes it as being one of the happiest moments in her life. And I think that Shelley's poem from 1819, Rosalind and Helen, really captures that.
Mary's husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley, wrote and set the poem in Italy and based the characters of Rosalind and Helen on Isabella and Mary. It must have been precious and poignant for Mary as she looked back on her days in that dearly remembered landscape of Scotland.
Talk with me of that our land, whose wilds and floods, barren and dark although they be, were dearer than these chestnut woods. Those heathy paths, that inland stream, and the blue mountains, shapes which seem like wrecks of childhood's sunny dream.